Papyrus enjoyed folding laundry. It was his second favourite chore. Something about starting with a basket of chaos and ending up with neat stacks of sorted clothing was satisfying on a fundamental level. He'd been catching up on laundry since he'd gotten up. He hadn't slept much, but that was just as well considering how much there was to do. Nice, mindless chores. When the silence got to him, he turned on the TV for some background noise, keeping the volume low enough not to wake his brother. Metaton's morning show was on. The boxy robot was chatting amiably with one of his guests over coffee that Metaton, lacking a mouth, couldn't drink. Papyrus wasn't paying attention to their conversation. He just let the soft chatter wash over him and kept folding, trying not to think. He winced when he made a careless reach for an unpaired sock. Flowey had healed him before letting him go last night, but his arm was tender, and would be for days. He took a couple of minutes to remind himself that he was safe in his home, to convince himself that he was okay for now. Movement upstairs caught his attention, and he looked up to find his brother leaning against the railing, watching him. That was 2 days in a row he was up early. "Was I too loud?" Papyrus said, reaching for the remote to dial the volume on the TV down farther.
"Nah," Sans said. "I woke up and I could see my floor. Thought we got robbed."
"Laundry bandits?" Papyrus said. "Not on my watch. You left your door unlocked, so..."
Sans chuckled and shambled down the stairs.
"You know, you don't have to do that, bro,"
he said, nodding at the basket. Papyrus shrugged.
"I don't mind."
He turned his attention back to his folding.
"There's coffee on the counter. You'll have to warm it up."
He felt Sans sit on the other end of the couch. Papyrus was aware his brother was staring at him, but he wasn't going to say anything. Not after yesterday. He didn't want to know what other vulnerabilities he'd shred if he snapped again.
"So,"
Sans said, after a long, awkward silence. And that was all it took. 1 second Papyrus was fine, and the next he quietly sort of caved in on himself.
"Oh, shit!"
Sans hurriedly scooted closer, putting a tentative arm around Papyrus's shoulders.
I'm sorry,"
Papyrus said, between sobs.
"I shouldn't have said anything I said. I'm sorry."
He hated crying. It was embarrassing and unbecoming, and the action itself was bringing up fresh trauma that he still was in the middle of pushing down and burying. Ugh, and he had the hiccups again. And then Sans had to go and make it worse by not even teasing him about it.
"Bro, it's okay,"
Sans said, sounding close to tears himself.
"It's okay. Deep breaths."
He gestured to the undershirt Papyrus had been folding, that he was now using to dab at his eye sockets.
"You want me to get you some tissues, or not?" he said. "I mean, it's still cleaner than it started out, right? It's a net gain."
It took what felt like hours for Papyrus to pull himself together. Sans sat with him the entire time, not saying anything, rubbing circles into Papyrus's back. Eventually, and by degrees, he was able to calm down, taking deep, shuddering breaths that served no practical purpose beyond forcing the tightness out of his chest. Finally, the storm passed, and he was left wrung out and empty.
"Feel better?"
Sans tried for what Papyrus assumed was a goofy smile and ended up somewhere in the middle of grimace territory. He nodded. He didn't trust himself to talk quite yet, in case he set himself off again. Sans got up to get that cup of coffee, and Papyrus picked up where he'd left off on the laundry. He set Sans's undershirt aside. He'd have to rewash it. Sans set his mug on the end table and settled down cross-legged on the floor. He matched socks for a few minutes in silence.
You know, I'm always here, right?
He said finally.
But if you need me to back off and give you some space for a while, that's fine too.
Papyrus sighed. He wanted nothing more than to tell his brother everything, even though there was nothing Sans could do about any of it. It would be easier to bear, he thought, if only someone else knew what was happening to him. Flowey's threat from that first night was always at the back of his mind, however. He couldn't slip up. He had to be strong on his own, for his brother's sake, and Undyne's, and everyone's. Sans kept talking, filling the silence.
Someone that I talk to now and then says that, people can get depressed after something really good happens to them, he said. Like, sudden success can actually make them feel kinda lost. Like they don't know what comes next.
He shrugged.
I don't know if she's right or not. Sounds kinda backward.
That must be it,
Papyrus said. It sounded backward to him too, but any ready explanation would do if it meant Sans would let the matter drop. Sans hummed thoughtfully. They sat for a few minutes more, until he coughed lightly.
So,
he said.
Not trying to freak you out, so don't cop me off to the doctor or anything, but have you ever just...
He gestured, trying to fish the right word out of the air.
Lost a few seconds. Like, the world skips like a scratch CD.
Papyrus looked at him. Last night, when Flowey just barely missed him with that attack, for a split second before he pushed himself up, it had felt like he chalked it up to standing up too fast. But it wasn't dizziness, was it? What was it then?
It happens to me sometimes. It happened last night, in fact. At, I don't know, around 11?
He gave Papyrus a searching look.
Maybe you stood up too fast.
Papyrus didn't know what Sans was on about, or what that stuttering feeling had been, or why they'd both felt it, but he knew no good would come of admitting to his brother that he'd noticed it too. Sans stared at him for a second longer, frowning, and then dropped his gaze to the socks in his lap.
Yeah, that must be it.
He picked up a single yellow sock.
Man, how come there's always one with no mate?
Tension left Papyrus's body that he hadn't realized was even there. Sans stood up, giving up on finding matches for the last few socks, and walked over to take a swig from his mug. He pulled a face.
Ugh, he said. How many times can you microwave coffee before it gets too gross to drink?
Papyrus shrugged. They both jumped at the sudden knock at the door. 2 snowdrakes and a nice cap. Some of the teenagers that liked to play survivalist out in the forest were crowded together on the front step.
Can we help you?
Papyrus frowned.
Is there some emergency?
No, the older looking of the snowdrakes said,
but we found something really freaky in the woods that you need to see.
The bottom dropped out of Papyrus's figurative stomach. Sans joined him in the doorway, shooting him a concerned glance. Then he turned his attention to the youths outside.
You mean we gotta do actual work today?
He whined. This seemed to soothe the teens somewhat, but it did nothing for Papyrus's nerves. He was halfway out of the door before remembering that he was still in his pajamas.
He said. Give us 10 minutes.
Whoa,
Sans said. Papyrus worked very hard to look as though he were seeing the hilltop for the first time.
Yeah,
the older snowdrake said.
The woods west of the town were getting a little crowded, so we came this way looking for a new hangout.
She fluffed up her feathers.
And we found this hill just tore the hell up.
Language, Papyrus scolded, but he couldn't put much feeling behind it.
So, like...
The ice cap spoke up.
What is it?
Papyrus frowned.
Hard to say, but you should definitely stay clear of this area until we find out. Tell your friends to do the same.
The trio muttered their assent. A matter of days ago, they would have just blown him off, but the armor conveyed authority. That actually annoyed him. He was still the same person with the same judgment. Why was he worth listening to now, just because he was lugging around a bunch of uncomfortable metal and a different title? The teens milled around talking amongst themselves while Papyrus and Sans investigated.
I'm at a loss, bro,
Sans said, towing a chunk of permafrost the size of his head. It came loose and rolled away down the hill.
Some kind of fight?
Papyrus gritted his teeth.
It's impossible to make out any tracks if so.
Partially because he'd been discreetly scuffing up any hint of his own footprints while he was looking around. Sans shrugged.
I can't imagine any of the kids that goof off out here will be able to do this kind of damage. Unless, he said, rubbing his chin, unless they're holding some kind of club for organized fighting. A fight club, if you will.
Papyrus frowned.
Really?
Hey!
Sans shouted to the teens.
You guys knocking on Fight Club? There's rules against that.
The trio looked at one another, then at Sans.
What?
Sans waved them off.
Bah, never mind.
He grinned up at Papyrus.
Fight Club theory goes in the maybe pile, he said.
As far as fake explanations went, Papyrus would prefer something more plausible.
Could it have been a stalagmite, do you think?
He peered up at the ceiling, though it was too far away and dark to make out.
You mean a stalactite, bro?
Papyrus shrugged, glancing sidelong at his brother.
What difference does it make?
Sans drew a cone shape in the air with his finger.
I think the ones that hang down are stalactites. The ones that sit on the ground are stalagmites.
Well, whatever,
Papyrus snapped, relieved beyond words that they were having a normal exchange.
Do you think it was one of the hangy down ones, then?
Could be, I guess,
Sans said.
Falling from that high up could probably make a pretty big mess of whatever it landed on.
He frowned.
Shouldn't there be pieces of it laying around?
That was a good point. Papyrus had hoped Sans would be bored enough by now to accept that explanation and leave. But he was actually taking this seriously. The one time Papyrus didn't want him to.
Well, he said, at least it was better than your club for fighting idea.
Which is still on the maybe pile, lest we forget,
Sans said. Papyrus scoffed.
Maybe your maybe pile.
Sans gave the hilltop another look around.
You know what we could do, he said. We could get Dogamy and Doggeressa out here to do some sniffing. They should be coming on duty soon, right?
That's,
Papyrus said, struggling to keep his voice level,
a really good idea, Sans.
He wanted to scream. Specifically, he wanted to scream, Sans, for the love of God, just lose interest already, or we are all going to die in ways that will likely be very unpleasant, and I would spend my final moments feeling incredibly awful for letting that happen. But he couldn't do that, because of the aforementioned unpleasant death issue. The absolute last people he needed here were Mr. and Mrs. Smell Everything Really Well. This must have been some kind of karmic backlash for all the lying and otherwise dishonourable behaviour he'd been perpetrating lately. Suddenly, his brother was a competent sentry, and it was all his fault. This was a disaster.
Yeah,
Sans said.
If we're going all the way back to town, though, I say we break for lunch. I missed breakfast and I'm getting a little hangry.
He snapped and pointed a finger at Papyrus.
That's hungry, angry.
That's not even a pun. That's just a stupid made-up word.
I think the results speak for themselves.
Papyrus brought a secret weapon when he and Sans returned to the hilltop with the dog couple in tow. He'd hoped to beat everyone else there, but the dogs moved surprisingly fast for monsters whose legs didn't lend themselves very well to bipedalism. Dogamy and Doggeressa got right to work once the group crested the hill, and Papyrus's heart sank. He'd never been able to figure out any kind of logic to the way the dog couple worked. He studied them now to keep himself from crying, but no new information revealed itself. They just ran around every which way, occasionally colliding with each other and generally looking like a pair of buffoons. After several minutes of this nonsense, they trotted up to Papyrus and Sans. Dogamy snapped off a quick salute.
We have findings to report, sir.
Yes, go on, Papyrus said, with the opposite of pleasure. Doggeressa clicked her heels together.
Sir, a preliminary sweep of the area put 6 principal scents on the scene. Firstly, she said, you!
She pointed an accusing paw straight at Papyrus. Papyrus jumped.
I,
he stammered.
And you!
Doggeressa continued, pointing at Sans. Papyrus blinked. He shut his mouth.
Also,
Dogamy added,
2 snowdrakes, female, aged 15 and 17, 1 icecap, male, aged 15, also of interest,
he said, leaning in.
The icecap had recently eaten a peanut butter sandwich.
Doggeressa nodded solemnly.
Yes, and now we both have a serious peanut butter Jones.
Sans chuckled.
Huh. Me too, actually.
It is spreading,
Doggeressa said.
I see what you did there,
Sans said.
and I approve.
He looked up at Papyrus.
Well, this was kind of a dead end, huh?
Looks that way, Papyrus said. He really was going to cry at this rate. His heart couldn't take the emotional whiplash it was being put through today. That had been too close. Dogamy held up a paw for attention.
Not necessarily, gentlemen,
He said.
As we said before, those were the results of our preliminary sweep.
Yes,
Doggeressa said.
with more time, we can accurately assess smells days or weeks old.
Well, get to it then.
Sans said, while Papyrus had a minor aneurysm.
Work your magic.
It is not magic, Sans.
Dogamy said.
Merely a skill honed through years of...
There was a small, sharp crack of glass against the frozen ground. 2 seconds later, the smell of peppermint filled the air. The dogs howled.
Oh no,
Papyrus said, raising a hand to his mouth.
my vial of peppermint extract that I keep on my person at all times for secret reasons. It must have fallen from my pocket, unintentionally.
Doggeressa whined.
Peppermint!
Dogamy covered his snout, vainly trying to keep the scent out of his nose.
Olfactory bulb shutting down. Too much minty.
Sans frowned.
Well, that's bad luck, he said. How long until you can smell again?
It will be weeks until we are fully recovered.
Dogamy said, rubbing his temples and giving Papyrus the stink eye. Sorry. Papyrus fought to keep a straight face. Disaster successfully averted. He refused to feel guilty for saving their lives, even if the pair had a nasty headache for a while. Headaches got better. Death, not so much.
Hey,
Sans said.
don't worry about it. What say I treat you two to some PB Sammies for your trouble?
What's the point?
Doggeressa grumbled, as they all started back down the hillside.
It's just going to taste like peppermint.
Papyrus looked down at what was apparently his meal.
Sans, when you said you were going to take care of dinner, I didn't expect this.
He looked across the table at his brother.
I don't know why I didn't expect it, of course.
Who's Sans? Just call me,
Sans said with a flourish.
Peanut Butter Jones.
You could have just let me cook.
Papyrus took a bite of his sandwich. Not even peanut butter and jelly, just peanut butter. No plate either. Sans shrugged, starting on his sandwich with more enthusiasm.
Nah, bro, it's my turn. I mean,
he said,
I think it was my turn about 100 turns ago. But I'm lazy, so...
Papyrus frowned.
Sans,
Bro,
Sans said.
It's fine. Just forget about it. I know I'm hard to live with.
He opened and closed his mouth a couple of times, looking pensive.
Huh. I think I'm remembering why I don't eat this stuff more often.
The problem with peanut butter, for a skeleton, was that it got stuck to the roof of the mouth like normal, but being without a tongue made it extremely difficult to dislodge. Papyrus was having the same trouble. Sans sighed.
Well, that's what we get for letting me cook. Let that be a lesson to you.
Papyrus winced. Hard.
You okay?
Yes, of course,
Papyrus said, a little bit too quickly.
Just... this peanut butter is driving me crazy.
That, at least, wasn't a lie. It was like a mouthful of glue. It wouldn't budge.
Just dig it out of there with your finger, bro. That's what I'm doing.
Papyrus sighed.
I can see that.
Not that he cared to. Disgusting.
Fine.
Leave it to his brother to mangle the basic tenets of dining etiquette at any and every opportunity. It was nice to get the peanut butter unstuck, though.
You're eating a dog.
Ark!
Papyrus took his finger out of his mouth and tried again.
What?
I said, you should have seen the dogs,
Sans said, hopefully done digging around in his mouth for the rest of the conversation.
They were licking their chops for a good 30 minutes after they finished their sandwiches. Hilarious.
They took you up on your offer?
Yeah, you're lucky I smoothed things over.
Sans leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers behind his head.
They were pretty peeved at you. Their eyesight isn't very good. You really did a number on them, knocking out the smellers like that.
Papyrus did his best to look appropriately remorseful.
That is unfortunate. I'll have to find some way to make amends for my clumsiness.
Sans's grin slipped.
Why'd you do it?
I just told you,
Papyrus said, avoiding Sans' eyes. He never noticed before now, but Sans was incredibly good at staring.
It fell out of my pocket in a moment of clumsiness.
Tch, Sans said, packing an essay of meaning into one syllable.
And since when do you carry peppermint oil around with you anyway?
Peppermint extract,
Papyrus corrected.
And,
he said, floundering for a lie that was even remotely believable.
Just in case, I found myself in a situation in which a kiss seemed imminent. It's prudent to be prepared for eventualities like that.
That was a thing that could have been true, right? On the off chance that someone wanted to kiss him while he was out and about, and they had bad breath, he could offer them the peppermint first. The logic was sound. Sans clearly wasn't buying it.
That's the biggest load of bullshit I've heard in a while,
he said. Papyrus didn't really want to start fighting again. This was so tiring he couldn't bear it.
Oh, all right,
he said, shoulders slumping in defeat.
I used that peppermint balm on purpose. I confess.
Why?
Because, Papyrus said. Because the truth is...
He paused, caught up in a moral crossroads. He gathered himself and forged ahead.
The truth is, I'm the one who tore up that hill. I've been practicing there because it's out of the way and I don't have to worry about breaking anything.
Sans sat back in his chair, deflating a bit.
Is that true?
Papyrus nodded. It wasn't a lie exactly.
I wanted to keep it secret. You know how those kids are. I'd have to find another spot if they found out I was there.
So, what you're telling me,
Sans said, leaning his elbows on the table,
is that when you say you're doing a night patrol, you're actually wandering out into the woods to goof around with your magic.
I'm not goofing around, Sans.
Papyrus at least didn't have to fake offense. Sans's grin crept back into place.
My brother is slacking off at work.
I'm doing no such thing.
Bro, I've never been more proud of you,
Sans said, wiping non-existent tears from his eye sockets.
I want to shout it from the rooftops.
You'd better not.
And this is just the beginning,
Sans winked.
If you want, I can show you all the prime napping spots. You just say the word,
he said with a grand sweeping gesture.
I can show you a whole new world of underachievement.
Papyrus crossed his arms, doing his best to look cheesed off. Seeing Sans back to normal had evaporated any irritation he would normally be feeling at the implication that he was in any way lazy.
I don't have to sit here and listen to this slander.
Seriously,
Sans said, pushing away from the table.
This might be the best day of my life. Not even exaggerating.
He gathered their abandoned sandwiches and dumped them in the trash. It was the first time Papyrus had seen him throw something away on his own in over a week. He supposed he should be happy about that, along with the attempt at making food. Instead, Papyrus found himself trying to suss out why Sans was acting so unnaturally functional. Either he was still stinging from Papyrus's rant yesterday, which was bad, or Papyrus was showing enough strain that Sans felt moved to try and take care of him, which was equally dire.
Hey,
Sans said.
Lesser Dog is on duty tonight, right?
He shuffled across the living room to rummage around under the TV stand in what, for him, counted as a flurry of activity.
Yes, I believe so.
Well, if you don't have anything else going on, my contact at the dump came through with this,
Sans said, coming up with the Human Car magazine. The cover was wavy from a long-dried spill.
Car and Driver, July 2009. Nice, huh?
He tapped the cover with one finger.
I'm really hoping this is just coffee or soda or something.
Garbage juice was never quite that benign, but faint heart never scored neat stuff. Besides, that was one good reason why Papyrus left the actual reading part to Sans, aside from necessity.
Only a few years old,
Papyrus conceded. One of the better publications too, in his opinion. Sans teased the stuck-together pages apart.
I haven't had a chance to read it yet, so I don't know if it's even any good, but we could go through it if you want.
Come to think of it, they had fallen out of their normal routine, hadn't they? Normally it would be Papyrus pestering Sans about reading to him. He was fascinated by cars, but he couldn't really read about them himself. Books he could mostly deal with, but the text in magazines was so small, and it was usually faded and stained too. And the print wasn't like a computer screen where he could resize the text and mess with the font to find something he could manage. After about 10 minutes with one of the human magazines, all the words swimming around and letter switching places left him with a headache. Truth be told, Papyrus couldn't really dredge up much excitement about only slightly obsolete automotive discourse. Technically, reading about cars had always been pointless. He'd never see one for real, much less get to drive one himself. Until recently, He'd gotten a lot of joy out of just learning about them. Daydreams were as important as oxygen to most monsters in the underground. But lately, he'd lost access to his dreams. If there had been anything close enough to lean on, Sans would have been leaning on it. The way he was peering over the top of the magazine, eyes glowing a little unevenly, betrayed exactly how nonchalant he actually was, which was not very.
Okay,
said Papyrus. What else could he say? Their couch was not comfortable. It was lumpy and there was a broken spring that always wound up digging into Papyrus's pelvis no matter how he sat. If Sans wasn't comfortable, he didn't show it. He tossed himself onto one end of the dreadful Davenport with a creak of springs. It took Papyrus a couple of minutes to fidget around for a passable configuration. He settled for sort of sprawling across the remaining cushions. Maybe if he spread himself out enough, that spring wouldn't... Nope, there it was. He sighed, defeated. Without knowing when the next one would turn up, they couldn't really be choosy about what they read and what they skipped over. They got into the habit of reading each magazine methodically cover to cover. As Sans moved from the letter from the editor, to the reader letters and responses, to the first of the editorials, Papyrus started to relax. Normally, he would be thoroughly engrossed in the articles, or wondering about what the humans who had written them were doing now and what kind of people they were and whether they were nice. He still couldn't recapture that spark of interest, but right now, it was enough to just bask in how ordinary it all felt. The light from the lamp, the lumpy but familiar couch, the sound of his brother's voice as he read about fuel injection systems or slightly disappointing sport coupes. It felt normal, and right, and safe. He realized, sleepily, that this was his new daydream. Just this. And he didn't really have this anymore, but it was nice, right now, to pretend. Papyrus didn't know when he'd dozed off, but when he woke up the clock on the wall read 2 a.m. Too early to get up. The magazine had slipped from Sans' hands to the floor, and he snored softly, head resting on his collarbone. Papyrus grabbed the Afghan from the back of the couch and draped it over him. He got up and turned the lights off, eyeing the stairs in the dim, colourful light of the fairy lights outside. A few of the steps were creaky, and he could never remember which ones. He didn't want to wake his brother. He also didn't really want to be alone, so he returned to the couch, curled up on the lumpy cushions, covered himself with a corner of the Afghan, and went back to sleep.